All right, let's jump into the history. We're going to start off with precursors to British thinking on race and class in the image of God. And bear in mind, when we use the term British, we're using a reasonably modern term. Remember, in the time of the Roman Empire, it was called Britannia. And the term British actually didn't get used till many years later. But I'm just going to use British throughout because otherwise it would just be kind of long-winded to keep trying to find the correct term that was used in that particular year that we're looking at. So before we even start thinking about British history, let's go back to Aristotle, right? So Aristotle lived 384 BC to 322. So this is over 300 years before Jesus was born. The Greek philosopher Aristotle was born, okay? And look what he thought about the middle classes, okay? Aristotle saw the middle classes as the norm from which the poor and the rich deviated, okay? And in a perfect society, he said that the middle classes would dominate. Now, that might not sound too harmless to some ears today, but think about it. Rather than centering on the great leveler of the image of God, he's centering on class, on middle class. Now, one thing we got from the image of God is that it's a great leveler to know that every human being is made in the image of God. That is amazing, an amazing leveler. But Aristotle is putting the center on middle class. In fact, he's actually making middle class the benchmark. And when you compare that with Jesus Christ in the incarnation, was he middle class? Well, he said himself that, some might say that some of the disciples being fishermen, having their own businesses were middle class. But when Jesus was doing his earthly ministry, he didn't have a business. Yeah, obviously earlier he'd been a carpenter, but he said that he didn't even have a home to lay his head in. Okay, so there's this homeless guy traveling around preaching the gospel. He's our benchmark. He's the perfect image of God. And he shows us the way to live in this life, not as a middle class man. That's not to say there's anything wrong with being middle class, but it's just to challenge Aristotle's idea of middle class being the norm, being the center from which everything else is judged. And this came up in the last roundtable discussion, how in some churches it comes across as if middle class culture is seen as the norm, and that the way people are discipled is to reflect middle class culture above other cultures. And you could trace this all the way back to Aristotle. Now, something that's even more interesting about Aristotle is what he thought about slavery. So check it out. This is what he wrote in Politics. He said that some should rule and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary, but expedient. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. Now, notice how this clashes with what we studied with the image of God, the idea that mankind, all the image bearers, were made to rule together. What Aristotle was saying that some should rule and others should actually be slaves. And that this actually comes from when they're born. So it's not even to do with a meritocracy of who works the hardest or anything like that. It's actually just how you're born. Some are fitted to be slaves and some are fitted to rule slaves, rather than the idea of ruling together. Aristotle actually sees it as a good thing to have slave masters kind of help people who are naturally slaves, who would be the people who aren't very intelligent. You know, it's like it's actually a good thing that these slave masters then actually give them some kind of direction and structure and everything in their life. Now, notice here, this is messing again with the image of God doctrine in terms of assessment. All humans have been made in the image of God with the ability to make assessments in their mind, to make evaluations in their mind. But Aristotle's seeing it as like you've got different groups of people, some who actually aren't very intelligent, who therefore should be slaves, therefore shouldn't rule. They lose some of their what it means to be made in the image of God because they're not now supposed to be ruling, they're supposed to be slaves. And it's because they're not very intelligent. So Aristotle was really influential later in British culture, really influential all over the place. And so this is significant that there was this view way back that then got brought into British society years later. Okay, let's go on to Pliny the Elder now. So we're talking about AD 77. He wrote a book called Natural History, and he described people around the world, and some of the people he described like they were monsters. Okay, so he talked about the Aramapsi, who had one eye in the middle of their forehead. And then he talked about Albanians, bald from childhood, they see more at night than during the day, quote. And then there were some people who he said they had a foot that was so big that it could be pulled over their heads as a sunshade. Okay, so these stories that were going out there in this very influential book from a very influential man meant that in the Roman Empire, okay, which would have included North Africa, would have included Egypt, would have included Britain, okay, so a wide geographical area, in people's imagination, there was the idea that there were some people out there who were not quite human. Okay, and that's significant for what happens later. So not everyone's thinking, yeah, everyone around the place, every person is made in God's image. People are thinking there's some people out there that are kind of like monsters. And then years later, AD 205 to 270, you've got a bloke who is, some would say, is the founder of Neoplatonism. And his name, however you want to say it, is either Plotinus or Plotinus, however you want to say it. What I really want people to get is that he systematized a thing called the Great Chain of Being. He took some ideas from Aristotle and from Plato, Greek philosophers, and he systematized them in a way that basically said you've got this linear gradation of beings from God downwards, and it creates a hierarchy. Okay, so he's talking about a hierarchy of beings, starting with God and then going down for all these different beings. And it obviously has massive implications for humanity, because right here, years before the theory of evolution, you've got this mindset, this possibility of there being some humans that just on a natural order are higher than others. And because at the top you've got God, it's like some humans are more like God than others. And it's a hierarchy that's a gradation. So again, this is a problem in light of the image of God, which shows us a big leveler. We're all made in the image of God, but Neoplatonism gives us this concept of a hierarchy, a great chain of being that really comes back to bite us later when we start talking about how people started thinking about race, but also how people started thinking about class as well. Now let's hear something encouraging. Let's go to Augustine, the great African theologian. Yeah, so he wrote a book called The City of God. He wrote this between AD 413 to 426, and he quotes Genesis 1:26 about mankind being made to rule. And he says this, he says, he did not intend that his rational creature who was made in his image should have dominion over anything but the irrational creation. In other words, he says, not man over man, but man over beasts. So that's what we were saying, right? And to really spell it out, he then says a few lines later, the condition of slavery is the result of sin. And then a bit later he says, it is a name, and this is where he's talking about the curse of Canaan. Remember, we said it's the first mention of class in the Bible, first mention of slavery, where it says slave or slaves. Noah says for Canaan. And it says here, it is a name, therefore, introduced by sin and not by nature. Okay, so Augustine, he doesn't think that some people are just born slaves. He doesn't think slavery is to do with your nature. He doesn't think there's some hierarchy that's there in nature. Instead, he thinks as a result of the fall, slavery came about, and that slavery is sin. And one of the places he gets this from is Genesis 1:26, where mankind is made in God's image so that they may rule over the beasts, so that they may rule over the animals, so that they may rule over the earth, but not rule over other humans. So what I want us to note here is, here you've got an image bearer using their God-given powers of assessment, which is part of being an image bearer, to look at the Bible, see what it says, come up with an assessment that says there's something in our culture that's wrong. The way we're treating image bearers is wrong. And so they're guided by God's word, by God's voice, and then they speak that out in their voice by writing a book. And they get their voice out there communicating to other people. And this is something that's going to be crucial as we go through the history of racism and classism, and seeing on the one hand, you've got people coming up with dodgy assessments, using their voices in dodgy ways, which creates untold destruction, death, horrific stuff. And on the other hand, you've got godly people who use their assessment, they use their voice to actually spread God's loving rule and to serve and protect. Okay, now let's get into something which is very tricky. And first off, it's tricky to know the dates for this. I found conflicting dates depending on which scholars I consulted. So I'm just going to say here, this first thing here is between AD 200 and AD 400, somewhere in a 200-year range. There's the Midrash Rabbah. And on Genesis 36, 7-8, this Jewish source says this. It's talking about what happened in Genesis 36, okay? And it says, Ham castrates Noah. So the way it's interpreting what happened to Noah when he then said, "Cursed be Canaan," it's saying that Ham actually castrated him. And then Noah gives him a curse and says this, "You prevented me from doing that which is done in the dark. Therefore, may your progeny be black and ugly." Okay, now, that's one translation. I mean, first off, I realize you might need a minute to sink in. You're like, what? That's not what it says in the Bible story. But this is how someone is interpreting this story. They are saying that this is what happened. But notice when it says, "Let your progeny be black and ugly," I did say last time that it's hard to translate skin colors. One reason is it's hard to know sometimes whether colors are being talked about people's hair or talked about their skin. Another reason why it's hard is that people didn't use the same words we use for skin color. Sometimes people would talk about someone being fair. They wouldn't say white, they might say someone was fair, and you've got to work out what do they mean by fair. Especially if, say, it's a Greek person using the term fair, what do they mean by fair? Because everything's relative from the view of the author. Sometimes people would talk, in English years later, people would use terms like swarthy, say someone has swarthy skin. Sometimes people would say someone has dark skin. People wouldn't use the terms that we use today like black and white, and later we will actually see some of the history of how this came about talking in terms of white and black. So one translation of this says dark-skinned and ugly as opposed to black and ugly. And basically the degree of color is translation dependent. Okay. What we can say from this is that dark skin here is being associated with a curse. Now, bear in mind, whoever wrote this, at that time, the modern concept of race didn't exist, so they wouldn't think about skin tone the same way we've been conditioned to think about it today. It might just be that the person who wrote this was just trying to give an account of how some people had darker skin than the people they were writing to, in which case it's definitely ethnocentric, and it's definitely an image bearer using their assessment in not a very good way and not using their voice in a very good way, because this causes all kinds of problems later on. A similar thing to this is around the same time period, but this could possibly go as late as 500 AD. So between 200 to 500 AD, you got the Babylonian Talmud. And if you go to Sanhedrin 108b, you've got this, it basically says Ham had sex on the ark. And the story goes that God had given instructions saying you're not allowed to have sex on the ark, but Ham has sex on the ark. And as a result, his skin was afflicted. Okay. Now, what I found really interesting here is that if you look at the Palestinian Talmud, instead of it saying his skin was afflicted, it says Ham went forth darkened. So even here, it's kind of interesting seeing people using different terms. One person says his skin was afflicted. Who knows what that means? Are they saying he got boils? Are they saying he got leprosy, or what? Another version is saying that he went forth darkened. And what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're saying Ham became a black man, but it might mean that. But it would, there's a scholar called David Goldenberg who's written a lot about the curse of Ham, the so-called curse of Ham, because it's not really a curse on Ham. And he said he thinks both of these stories, these rabbinic stories, could have been written as just explaining how some people had dark skin. Whatever their motives were, there wasn't a modern concept of race back then, but what they said ended up causing all kinds of problems later. It was certainly used to justify all kinds of problems later. Now let's talk about white slavery. Funny term to talk about white slavery in this early period in Britain, because people didn't think in terms of white. But this is what Nell Payne, how she describes it. She talks about how in Europe around these times, slaves were white. Okay, in terms of modern categories, we'd say they were white. So think of St. Patrick, in the middle of the 5th century or the late 5th century. St. Patrick was in Britain. He got kidnapped, ended up being a slave in Ireland when he was 16 years old. He was a slave for, I think it was 6 years. And then he escaped. And then he went back to Ireland as a missionary. He was a white guy. Back then in England, if you saw slaves, they were white. If you thought of what's a slave, you'd think of someone who had pale skin. You wouldn't think of an African. Okay, that's something people would think later. And Nell Painter, I think I called her Nell Payne earlier. Nell Payne's an old friend of mine. If you're out there, shout out to Nell Payne. It's Nell Painter. Nell Painter, and you'll find videos of her on YouTube teaching this stuff. And she's written an excellent book called The History of White People. And she's pointed out that around this time in European literature, look how they describe European slaves, right? They described them in an unfavorable way. They described them as sexually aggressive, drunk, suntanned, ugly, lazy, prone to gossip and quarreling. Now, if you know about the history of transatlantic slavery and racism, you know that some of these things are things that people would later say about Africans. And I think what you're getting here is your first hint of the link between classism and racism. The fact that there will be certain narratives that people will say about the lower classes, no matter what their skin color is. And people will just make up this stuff to say about anyone if they're at the so-called bottom of the pile. Now, something that Nell Painter writes about is how common slavery was in Britain in the 11th century. She says that about 10% of Britain was enslaved. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine now in Britain if 10% of us were slaves? If 1 in 10 people you knew were slaves? It's mad, isn't it? Not only that, the church owned slaves. Even though Augustine said what he said and the Bible says what it says, the church actually owned slaves. But in 1066, you got the Norman conquest. Remember the Battle of Hastings and all that? That actually reduced slavery. But it replaced slavery with serfdom. Okay, now I'll let you look up serfdom in your own time. We're not going to go down that corridor tonight. But what happened now was that 40 to 50% of the rural population were in hereditary servitude. So now you had serfs, and in the rural areas, about almost half of the people were basically these serfs, and it was hereditary, so they were born into it. Okay, so it's not a good system, and it's different to in the Bible, in the Old Testament, when there's laws about slavery. You see time limits put on how long people can be a slave, and you see the year of Jubilees where people have to be released from slavery. So this is interesting that in Britain you end up with this hereditary servitude. Now let's talk about the Italian theologian Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so he wrote I was going to say Contra Gentiles, but I think it's Contra Gentiles. But those of you who know me know I pronounce absolutely everything wrong. So just anything you hear me pronounce, don't copy it, because everything has gone through the filter of a London accent, okay? Never trust my pronunciations. 1258 to 1265 was the time period when he wrote this. This is like one of his biggest books. I mean, the one you probably know him for is Summa Theologica. But this was big as well. And he followed Aristotle's thinking here, because he said this. He said, and I'm not saying that he disagreed with what Augustine said, but he did say this, which is problematic. There is also found an order among men themselves. So right there's this idea of hierarchy, okay? And he says, indeed, those who excel in understanding, so in other words, those who are intelligent, who have good powers of assessment, those who excel in understanding naturally gain control. Now check that out. He's claiming there that the people who do end up having control over others, who others end up serving, that it's a natural result of intelligence. Very interesting. And then he says, whereas those who have defective understanding, but a strong body, seem to be naturally fitted for service. So notice here, he's saying the people that end up being servants or slaves, they're the people that have a defective understanding. They're not very intelligent, but they have a strong body. Okay, very interesting. And then he agrees with Aristotle, because he says, as Aristotle says in his Politics. And then he says, the view of Solomon is also in accord with this, for he says, the fool shall serve the wise. That's interesting. He's quoting Proverbs 11:29, and he's taking the wisdom genre terminology of fool, and he's applying it to intelligence. Now, I think most of you probably know that in the Proverbs, when it says the fool, it's not talking about someone who doesn't have intelligence. Can I see a nod from people who get that? It's not. There's plenty of things it says about the fool, which very intelligent people have said and do. That's not what it means in wisdom genre. But Thomas Aquinas is impacted by Aristotelian thought. Okay, and he's a great Italian theologian, and his way of thinking also comes over into Britain. Now contrast this with Adam in the garden being called to serve. In Genesis 2:15, he's called to serve and keep the garden. The Hebrew word is avad. And you see throughout scripture this idea of serving, and how it's not linked to a lack of intelligence. That's not a biblical way of thinking, that if you're of low intelligence, then you do the serving stuff. But this ends up being in European thought. So these are some of the interesting precursors to the racism and the classism that comes later. But we're not there yet where it properly kicks off. We're still at the precursors. We're now going to talk about the 14th century. Okay, the 14th century is the 1300s. I know it's proper frustrating that the 14th century is the 1300s, as well as having daylight saving scrapped. So we just the same time every year, and we just permanently stay on daylight saving time. I'd like to see that happen. My second thing is I'd love the first century to be in the 100s, and the second century the 200s, and the 14th century to be the 1400s. I would love that. It really frustrates me. But until the Prime Minister responds to my many emails, we're stuck with it this way. So when I say 14th century, think of the 1300s, okay? In the mid 14th century, you get this book called Mandeville's Travels, and you get this map, Mappa Mundi, a map of the world. And with these two artifacts, the impression that Europeans have of Africa ties in with some of the stuff that Pliny the Elder said years before, okay? And Egyptians in it are depicted as lying naked in the hot sun. And Africa's described as having monsters in it, having these monopods, like people with just one foot, okay? These monopods in Ethiopia and Asia, and then these blemmies. These people, they don't have any heads, okay? They got no heads, so imagine their shoulders is where their body stops. And they have faces on their chests, okay? And then there's these people, the Marmony, who have 4 eyes, and they're ruled by the Cyclops. I think you know who the Cyclops is, you know, the big dude with 1 eye. Okay, so imagine that. There's been this travel book that tells you these are the people that I've seen in Africa. And what it does is it dehumanizes Africans. Not only that, but it centers humanity around Europe, where Europe starts to be seen as Europeans are what humanity is, and the Africans are something other. So it's setting up the idea that Africans might not be made in the image of God. And I'm not saying that anyone's saying that yet, but I'm saying it's setting up the idea for that. Now, around this time, what's interesting as well is, remember the curse of Ham myth? Well, that made its way to the Muslim world. And you know probably that there was Muslim slave trading going on of Africans. And Muslims had heard this myth, and some of them agreed with it as the reason for slavery, and some of them didn't. So, for example, back then in the 14th century, you got a Muslim historian, Khaldun, who he disagreed with his contemporaries who said that Negroes are the children of Ham, the son of Noah, and that they were singled out to be black as the result of Noah's curse, which produced Ham's colour and the slavery God inflicted upon his descendants. So this myth got received by the Muslim world with mixed views. Now, David Goldenberg, he thinks that this myth then went from Muslims and through trade routes went to Europe. When I've looked into it, I felt like it was too hard for me to work out for sure which way the myth of the curse of Ham made its way into Europe, but it eventually made its way into Europe, and we hear it come up a lot in the future.